Hey, it's Dr. Pedram. Welcome back to the Urban Monk. Today is a special day. I have Grandmaster Carl Totton, who's my Kung Fu master and the abbot of our lineage here. He's a doctor, he's a professor, he's got PhDs in education and psychology, he's a professor of psychology, and he basically is a student of life. It is an honor to have him here. We're going to get deep into the Urban Monk Juju and really dig into the philosophical basis of some of the stuff that we've been talking about in the book, in the show, and a lot of the content that we do. So I'm super excited about that. Just a quick prelude. Next week, it's National Students Against Violence Week, and I have a panel with Students Against Violence Everywhere, which is called SAVE, and we're really going after bullying. We're really going after this problem in our culture and finding solutions. Don't just be a witness. Let's step up and let's be our brother's keeper. Let's help each other make this problem go away. So that's next week. Right now, we're going in with Dr. Carl Totton, and we're getting into the essence and the roots of what makes an urban monk. And let's go there now. The words Kung Fu can translate to hard work or eat bitter. And it's one of those things that's just kind of like so foreign in the culture that we live in, because everyone's looking for, you know, a fast ticket or fast ride to somewhere. And so let's get into the kind of the essence of this and where it came from in China, so that we can kind of assemble around it, because we're going to end up talking about life philosophy a lot more than fighting here.
Well, Kung Fu, it's really an evolution. It has a long history going back actually probably several thousand years into Chinese history. And it's not just the martial art, because many of the people most responsible for putting the art together were not primarily fighters. I mean, some were, they were working for emperors, and of course, all the battles and wars they had in China. And so obviously they were interested in, combat and self-defense. But in terms of what we actually have received to this day, a lot of it was put together by monks and priests from places like the famous Shaolin Temple in China and Taoist monasteries as well. Another big influence was actually Chinese medicine, doctors of acupuncture and Chinese medicine, like yourself, who obviously were interested in good health and long life, because that may be the ultimate in self-defense, right? You outlive all of your opponents. And that may be the sweetest revenge of all. So at these temples in China, the priests and the monks were concerned with several things. Obviously, they were concerned with spiritual cultivation, meditation, learning how to have mind-body integration so they could produce better human beings. At the same time, they were isolated, and they didn't necessarily have, local police that they could call to protect them if someone were trying to come in and steal their stuff and take them out at the same time. And so over the centuries, they learned how to become self-sufficient, which included learning how to take care of themselves physically, mentally, spiritually, and also in terms of self-defense. And so they created movements based many times on the movements of animals. They were real big sticklers for being in harmony with nature. And so they would look at how the animals would protect themselves, tigers and leopards and snakes and cranes and monkeys and all sorts of things. And then they would mimic their movement and apply it to their own situation. And they could apply it to their situation in several ways. One, of course, animals are very spontaneous. They can't help it. That's all they know. And so they like the spontaneity of how animals just existed and how they just lived in harmony with nature. They also like the fact that animals, when they are attacked, really can defend themselves, and again, in a very spontaneous and very powerful way. And so they looked at mimicking the movements of the animals, and that's what led to the creation of the so-called 5 animals of the Shaolin Temple: the tiger, the dragon, leopard, snake, and crane. And then they would move like these animals as a way to try to enhance their own well-being and ways of living with spontaneity.
You were one of the original guys. I mean, you're an OG kung fu guy, right?
Ah,
Like, back when it started to first come over, you had the real distinct honor of becoming the senior student of a couple of the legends. And so I'd like to kind of talk about some of this history because people think China's kind of got it going on still, and what happened in those temples and how it was almost like a Chinese diaspora for anyone who was into any of this cool stuff. So,
yeah.
how did that happen, and how did you end up becoming just kind of, probably the luckiest guy on earth in the Kung Fu universe here?
Sometimes I think so. You know, a lot of historical things, as we all know, happened in China that tended to suppress a lot of the ancient traditions. So when the government changed, they were interested in suppressing a lot of the ancient knowledge and skills because they had a new agenda. And so that opened the door for us. There were several early instructors of Chinese martial arts, who had been teaching in the Chinese community, for many, many years. One of my teachers, in fact, since 1921, and that's a long time. He taught in San Francisco and Oakland and in Los Angeles. But around 1960, all the doors seemed to open. Up in Seattle area, Bruce Lee, who we all know about, began teaching his first non-Chinese student. In Oakland, another teacher began teaching another non-Chinese student. And then down in Los Angeles, around 1960, a couple of teachers began to open that door a crack and began accepting their first non-Chinese students. And one of those gentlemen, who actually was a master from Hawaii, named John Leone, he became my first instructor in 1963. So I guess that kind of makes me one of the OGs because I did start a long time before most people would ever even heard the name Kung Fu. Most people would probably think, if you mention Kung Fu, they think, oh, is that some type of Chinese food or something? Because back then, the only martial arts that people had ever heard about were things like judo, jujitsu, and then even karate was pretty much just emerging into the consciousness of the American public. And so my teacher, who was, like I said, he was a Hawaiian master, he was a Chinese Kempo karate master. He became one of these first people in 1960 to actually begin allowed to study Chinese Kung Fu. And that's how I actually started. As a young man, you know how young men are, just kind of growing up in the hood. I grew up in kind of central Los Angeles, where self-protection was always something on my mind because it's something we had to deal with frequently. Yeah. And so when I looked around for martial arts, there were a lot of karate schools, kind of Japanese karate schools. And then suddenly, like a miracle from heaven opening up, this Hawaiian teacher opened up this school where he was teaching the Chinese martial arts. So I immediately joined, and here, 53 years later, I'm still doing it. That's how.
Yeah, and you're a torchbearer. I mean, you studied with Ark Wong, who is one of the main Shaolin instructors in the world, and Sher K. Lu, who's came from a Taoist lineage through which we've all drawn and learned and really brought to us something else that wasn't a big part of the conversation until then, which was this concept of qi. And the energy that runs through us that's applied not just in the martial arts, but in the healing arts and through the culinary arts and all this. So what is this qi for our listeners who don't know, because I'm yapping about it all the time, but what is this qi and how does it integrate into our understanding of Kung Fu and self?
Well, the word qi means energy. And as we know from, science, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, energy essentially is the substrate, the actual substance that everything in the entire universe is composed of. And thousands of years ago, the ancient Chinese, through their spiritual studies, through their medical studies, acupuncture, they also became aware that this energy animates and actually is the life force that allows us as human beings and everything else in existence to exist. And so they began studying energy and how it manifests in the human body. And of course, doctors, were interested in health and healing. And in Chinese medicine, as you well know, when the energy is blocked, when it's stagnant, when there's too much, when there's too little, when it's basically out of balance, that begins to send a person down the road of ill health. And so they began studying how could they enhance health by improving this balance and the quality and nature of the energy in the human body. Now, how does that relate to martial arts? Well, martial artists are interested in operating at the peak of their proficiency. Peak performance is something that's always on the mind of a martial artist because we always want to get better. We want to improve ourselves. We want to make our strikes better, our punches better, our movements more fluid and smooth and more powerful and natural. And so by working with those same laws, learning how to breathe properly, learning how to focus the mind, how to focus attention, how to focus awareness, and by linking the body, the mind, the breath with the motion, with the spirit, martial artists began to elevate their skills to higher and higher levels. And then by hooking that with the movements of the animals that I was talking about a little while ago, they reached heights of skill that had been unseen in terms of combat, as well as in terms of things like meditation and good health. You might say it's kind of like the complete package. I always say that human beings are holistic. We can't help it, right? We have a right brain, we have a left brain, we have a body, we have a mind, we have a heart. We have the capacity to think and to relate to things in increasingly sophisticated ways. And so by learning how to work with the energy of the body and the energy of the world and the energy of everybody else who's in the world, we actually get to the point where we can relate to people and ourselves in increasingly sophisticated levels, which I think elevates all of humanity. And that is kind of you might say, the end game is how can we all are here on this earth for X number of years. What are we going to do while we're here? If we can elevate so that we're operating at the peak of our performance, that moves humanity to the next level. And that is what, the word Kung Fu means hard work. Working at what? What are we really trying to improve, if not ourselves and humanity? Yeah. That's the end game. And that's what I think is what the martial arts has done for so many centuries. And that's why people like myself do it our entire lives, because we see ourselves just getting better and better the longer that we do it. It gives us a template from which to improve ourselves to increasingly sophisticated levels of being, of actualization, of becoming a more realized human being.
How much of this is something that's fascinating to me, is how much of that element of mortal combat, of having everything on the line. I mean, look, coming in number 2 in a fight doesn't get you like the smaller trophy. It gets you a busted nose, right? at best. And so how much of that mortal combat really forces presence? Because, I mean, we came from an environment that really asked of us to really step into survival. And it seems that our insulation from that has also kind of taken the stakes down, which has also drawn our attention to a place where it doesn't really matter. I mean, we could train, we could do some peak performance and some neurofeedback, or we could get a drink. Whereas those guys are coming, they're 2 days out from the village, and we better sharpen our swords or we're all dead.
That's correct. See, and I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about the martial arts. One can approach it on all those different levels. Now, just in terms of just survival, which of course is number one, right? Because if we're not here to survive, all bets are off. So remember, at the monasteries, they were often getting attacked. And if they failed to defend themselves, they were gone. They were dead. And so when you're dealing with life and death, that really raises the ante. You've got to be really serious about what you're doing. And so that is what led them to really cultivate the highest level of martial arts skills that really have probably ever been seen on planet Earth. Because when you're a monk in a temple for 25 or 30 years on a mountaintop, what are you going to do all day besides, cultivate the land and, of course, a lot of meditation? Well, they spent a lot of their day practicing. And so over time, they became known as probably the greatest fighters in the history of mankind. And so today, I teach all of my students that we have to set individual goals. because we don't want to get to the point where we let people who have lesser consciousness and lesser ethos and ethics than us take us out of the game so they can go get more crack to smoke tomorrow. That's not an equal way of living and being in the world. And so we want the good people to survive. And to do that, we have to become better at this game of what people think of as violence than the people who would perpetrate violence against us. Our job ultimately is to take the idea of violence out of people's minds by us being so good that we can just sense it even before it happens and basically not even be there. Or if it does happen, that there was that TV show back in the 70s called Kung Fu, with David Carradine that everybody knows about. And the ethics of that place was this in terms of fighting. They said, one should avoid rather than check, and check rather than hurt, and hurt rather than maim, and maim rather than kill, because all life is precious and no life can be replaced, not even that of the meanest creature. And so, out of respect for mankind, even those of us who have really high-level martial arts skills, where we could do a lot of damage with one strike, essentially even ending lives, if we can take that ability, but by knowing that we have that ability, have so much self-confidence that we don't get in those situations, or we can talk ourselves out of those type of situations, or we can do something less than lethal violence to prevent someone else from delivering that type of violence towards us. If we can do that, then everybody wins. Everybody walks away a winner. If everybody walks away. Yeah. And I don't want to be the one sitting on the ground, broken and bleeding. But I'd rather not my so-called attacker and opponent be that either, if I can help it. And if I can't help it, then, well, karma will sort it all out eventually.
There's so many layers to this that it just gets me chomping at the bit, because first of all, you have to have those skills. Like you have to have those skills to be able to throttle back and have the choice to be kind of graciously capable of doing that, or else you're just getting pushed around, and that's kind of humanity to begin with. But something you said just kind of sparked me, because it seems like to a certain extent there are elements within our culture that push us around and drive us to vote and vote for this guy or move this way, buy your stuff at Walmart and hurry up because it's Christmas, and we've all kind of fallen asleep to that, and we don't take a stand either. And one of the great stories of the martial arts is the Shaolin Temple. And what happened with these monks as, Damo, or the patron saint, showed up and kind of changed the game and elevated it. And we now know of it almost, the only way we know of it in kind of popular culture is the Jedis and where George Lucas drew from that. But I'd love for you to bring that story forward, because I think that it's a really powerful one for everyone to know.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was this Buddhist temple in China called Shaolin, which means young forest, actually, because it was in a young forest at the time. And this was back in the 6th century, back in the, like 525 AD in terms of our calendar. Chinese calendar, of course, is much older. I think it's over 4,000 years right now. And so when Bodhidharma, an Indian priest, walked, you couldn't take a train or a plane then. He walked across the Himalaya. Get that through your head, number one. He walked across the Himalaya and into China, and actually managed to get an audience with the Emperor of China. And the Emperor of China knew who he was. This was a successor to the original Buddha in India. And this emperor had done a lot to spread Buddhism throughout China. And this, of course, is older type of Buddhism, where they spent a lot of time, meditating, repeating sutras. It was a very structured type of practice. And so when he had this audience with this elevated Buddha, Bodhidharma, and the emperor, as emperors are wont to do, was bragging about all the things he had done in China, to elevate Buddhism. And he asked Bodhidharma, of what value is all of this? Kind of like, am I going to get brownie points in heaven, basically? And the Bodhidharma told him, it's of no value whatsoever. Can you imagine telling the Emperor of China all of his efforts are of no value whatsoever?
Sorry, chump.
That's a good way to lose your head.
Yep.
And so Bodhidharma basically had to escape from the palace and basically kind of go into hiding. And where did he go into hiding? At the Shaolin Temple. Now, he wasn't warmly accepted when he went into the Shaolin Temple. Yeah, remember, they had these old practices, and he had a new way of perceiving, a way where he said one should perceive directly from one's heart, from one's immediate experience. And he felt that just sitting and reading sutras and repeating mantras over and over and just spending all day long just in seated meditation, he felt that this was not the way to really become an enlightened being, that was not necessarily going to work. And so he moved into a cave right off the Shaolin Temple and supposedly sat in his cave for 9 years, quote, listening to the ants scream. Wrap your mind around that. Listening to the ants scream. And during this period of time, he became even more enlightened to the point where when he went back into the temple, he had this completely new way of teaching the monks how to become more immediately into the moment, into the present moment. Because ultimately, that's all any of us have, is right here, right now. That became the basis of Chan, which in Japanese is pronounced Zen. So he became the father, the patriarch of Zen Buddhism, which, of course, as we know now, has spread throughout the entire world. And the practices that he taught, practices for linking the body and the mind, these were taught to the monks over centuries, and that actually became the basis of the physical movements of both Kung Fu and the practice of what the Chinese call Qigong, energy work, which is their form of Chinese yoga and meditation. So he became the father of a lot of things that have had an enormous impact on the world today.
So there's a secret sauce that you taught me as part of kind of the Qigong gestalt and what actually activates it. And it's the coordination of the body movements with the eyes, the mind, and the breath. And so we're talking about this moving form of meditation that's integrating your mind and body, which became the Qigong and the basis of the Kung Fu. I'd love for you to kind of just unpack that a little bit more, because the Western mind goes to the gym and pushes weights on the bench press. The Western mind goes jogging until they have to get the knee replaced. And this is a completely different way of looking at our interaction with our physical universe.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that has always been a big part of Chinese philosophy and Chinese cosmology is the notion of balance. Everyone has heard about yin and yang. Yang being things that are more externalized, things that are heavier, hotter, higher, faster. And yin, not really the opposite, but its complement. If one thing is high, then that makes sense because there's a concept of something that's low. If something is heavy, well, something has to weigh less. If something is fast, then something needs to be slow. If something is external, something needs to be internal. You put all that together, you have a unity. There's a holism about that. All human beings are holistic. However, not all human beings are equally balanced in their holism, unfortunately. And so I think that the message that came out of the Shaolin Temple and out of the Taoist temples was a script, a cosmology that allowed them to have practices that would increase the practitioner's ability to feel, to exhibit this balance, this interconnectedness. And their script was, if we were able to take our right brain and our left brain and put them together, so that's the mind, the consciousness, with movement, because as human beings, we can't help but move, right? We're moving all the time, all day long, with breath, and then eyes, because our eyes, it's always been said, the eyes are the window of the soul. And so by putting together the eyes, the mind, the movement, and the breath, that allows us to move to a type of internal and external unity and harmony that elevates everything else that we do. Our relationships, our behaviors, our skills, our creativity, and our martial arts. Because if a martial artist is split and doesn't have access to their whole body and their whole being, they're not going to be very good. They're not going to be very good. And so the martial arts became this vehicle for self-perfection in concert with this yogic breathing method called Qigong, or energy work. Kung Fu means hard work, and then Qigong is energy work. And so when you put the hard work and the energy work together, wow, you've really got something special. And I think that's why it's been around for thousands of years, because people feel it's special when they do it.
Yeah, and there's principles of motion and things that are built in that are just, they're viscerally intuitive once you learn them, and so the geometries that you apply that suddenly make you better at Kung Fu. I mean, we all kind of know of it as like wax on, wax off with Mr. Miyagi and all, but you know, once I learned the principles of movement in Kung Fu, it didn't matter what the guy threw, because I had the principle that just kind of intercepted that in my, just kind of booted up in my RAM, right? And so I'd love to kind of allude to that, because people are all looking at different fighting techniques and, this kind of punch versus that kind of kick. And this is a step up philosophically, and it's more of an understanding of principles and movement. And I think that that's missing from the conversation in our current kind of like octagon, gladiator world.
Right. Martial arts can be really subdivided into a few areas. Basically, two main areas in terms of this physical motion. They're analogs to like boxing. Boxers, punch, and kickboxers punch and kick. And so a lot of martial arts are basically kind of punching and kicking arts. Things like a lot of kung fu, karate, kempo, taekwondo, that probably many of our viewers have heard of. And then there's the analog, the comparison to wrestling. Things like judo, jiu-jitsu, aikido. These are kind of Asian ways of wrestling, like karate and taekwondo and kung fu are kind of Asian ways of boxing. Now, how does a human body move? What is a human body really capable of? Well, one way of looking at pretty much everything in this universe, it kind of comes down to mathematics, really to geometry. The whole universe is constructed of shapes. And the biggest shapes, particularly here on Earth, that we deal with are squares, circles, and triangles. These kind of biomechanics pretty much define everything that we do, all of our structures, back from the time of the pyramids up until today, really mimic this. And human biomechanics, or human movement, also mimics this. And so if we have an understanding, based on this geometry of how human beings move naturally, and remember the priests were watching the animals, because they can't help but move naturally. Whereas because of our brains, particularly our left brain, sometimes we overthink things and lose some of our natural ability. So by going back and watching the animals, and the Taoists especially, they were huge at watching nature, right? The wind, the sea, the mountains, the land, the seasons, the progression of seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. They saw how everything had a natural ebb and flow, ups and downs. And by aligning us, the human organism, with these natural processes in nature, they felt that we could elevate so that we could internalize as natural reactions the ability to both live a highly effective life, or, if you needed it for self-defense, to have spontaneous reflexes built into the system that automatically protected you. So you didn't have to go thinking, if someone punches this way, how am I going to block it? How am I going to deflect it? Beginners have to think that way because they're beginners. They haven't internalized this at that reflexive level yet. But the more advanced practitioners, we can really enter into it with the so-called Zen mind, the empty mind. And then whatever happens, we just have to just stay there in our space, in our center, holding our center, and then simply allow the body-mind reactions to take over and protect us. And that's where all martial artists want to get to. We want to get past that mechanical phase to the spontaneous phase. It starts mechanical and then goes to spontaneous. It's kind of like water, which, as we know, can exist in many different forms. The hardest is like ice, where it's solid but frozen. It can't really move around very much, But then if it melts, it becomes much more liquid, right? It can flow. It's a fluid now. But the highest state is when it becomes gas, right? A vapor, which is capable of expansion in all dimensions simultaneously. And so a martial artist, we want to go from that stiff, rigid perspective to becoming more flowing, to becoming spontaneous and capable of moving in all directions simultaneously, because we're at zero. We're at absolute zero, where everything is possible.
Oh, I love it. It's such a reflection of the philosophy that's basically captured in the practice, and that's where, I think a lot of these, like, I could sit down right now and dream up some sort of like Pedram Pilates, Soul Cycle, jumping jacks, new exercise fad bullshit, and get a good branding company to just, push it out there, and everyone likes like, oh, have you tried the new thing? The new thing isn't always integrated in the way the old thing has been. And so, I think that this is a testament to kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and understanding that stuff with lineage actually matters. And look, I don't have to tell you, you're a guy that's been holding it down your whole life, right? And so there's very few people on the planet that know what you know, and arguably I'd say there's no one that knows what you know, but there's elements of the things that you know. And so I think that there's a responsibility to carry the lineage and pass it on, and help people with kind of fickle attention spans and that are interested in the Kardashians maybe wake up. But what is the challenge here in conveying this type of mind, body, spirit practice to a world that's caught up in bullshit?
Yes. Well, and that is a dilemma. Remember, these arts were practiced in ancient China for very practical and long-term reasons. First of all, you had soldiers who obviously needed it every day for combat, and that was just part of the reality. If you look at the history of mankind, much of the history of mankind is determined by what? Wars of occupation or liberation or aggression or something. Unfortunately, if you look, almost all of our history is defined that way. We've got a lot to learn. That's why that spiritual part is so important. Or you had people who were in the monasteries, maybe their entire lives, who had hours and hours a day to practice. Now, how many of us, you out there, have hours and hours and hours a day to sit and meditate or practice martial arts? Not a whole lot of you, I would guess. And so the challenge is to take an art that is so deep and embedded at so many levels, and to modernize the instructional component of it so that we can have some of the outcomes that the ancient ways of practice led to, but we can fit into our modern day life and schedules. That's the challenge. And the way that we have come up with doing that is something called a gong. Remember, gong, like gong fu, means work. And so by setting really an active goal and saying, this is what a gong is. Okay, every day for the next 100 days, I am going to commit myself to do X, Y, and Z every day. I'm going to stretch. I'm going to practice my basic blocks. I'm going to practice my forms. I'm going to practice some mind-body work, some qigong. And every day for 100 days, I am going to commit myself to an outlined, written down form of practice, so that my body begins to do what the ancient masters did, which is internalize things at the mental, physical, and emotional and spiritual levels. All human beings are creatures of habit, all of us, good habits and bad habits. And we all know what our bad habits are. And so this is a good habit that you want to embed in your body, your soul, your consciousness, so that you can begin to increase your skills. Because the body loves routine. Human beings love routine. Animals love routine. All of nature loves routine. In spite of the fact that the ancient Taoists said that the only constant in life is change. But change, if it doesn't follow some type of rhythm and order, like spring, summer, fall, winter. It's changing every day, but it's still following kind of a script. We want our body to follow a script so that we can adapt to the changes of life, the mental changes, the physical changes, the relational changes, the behavioral changes in a way that allows us to be at our peak of performance. Because what? We've been practicing our gong. We have this pattern that we have embedded in ourselves so that no matter what change happens, it's not just chaotic change, it's a more functional response to change. Because we cannot control what goes on out there. Just try. But you do have some input into how you function, how you think, your emotional state, and certainly your physical readiness. That each human being has free will to develop that. And ultimately, we're trying to increase our freedom. And each person who practices martial arts is trying to increase their personal freedom. And if you are a slave to old ways of thinking, old ways of emoting, old ways of physically just being in the world, you have no freedom. You're a slave. And there's two things that are bad to be in this world. One is a prisoner and one is a slave. And often we wind up imprisoning and enslaving ourselves because we don't have the tools necessary, like a gong, to constantly improve ourselves. And that's the gift that I want to really transmit to my students, is their capacity to feel confident in their ability to be up to the challenge of living in a world that is uncertain and in many cases very chaotic in its approach to change. But because we are disciplined, we're up to the challenge. Whereas a person who doesn't have this type of mind-body discipline often feels at an extreme disadvantage and winds up feeling how? Powerless. There's nothing worse than feeling completely helpless and powerless, that you have no self-agency and you have no control over how you live and create in this world. And that's my gift, really, to my students and to the world. Creativity.
Love it.
And freedom.
So you mentioned the word agency, and it seems, any given day of the week you turn on the news and it's like, oh my God, how powerless am I? Now these bad guys got a nuke, they blew up something over here, and the walls are caving in. And so when you feel helpless, that narrative almost comes from the outside in, and then makes you feel helpless when you see the cheesecake. It makes you feel helpless when you're like, I don't feel like exercising. What's going to draw me off this sofa? And so what I'm hearing from you, and I just want to reiterate because it's just such an important point, is you have to bring that nexus of personal power back to the internal, and then it radiates out from there. And I think it's like everyone's flipped the script, trying to change a world from the outside in versus the other way around.
Doesn't work. Life is an inside game. Sorry, folks. Life is an inside game. But that's the good thing about it, because what control do we have of the outside? What control do you have over what's happening in the Ukraine or the Middle East or anywhere else? Zero, none, right? But you have complete control over what you do with your mind and your body, if you know how. If you don't know how, then no. Then you really feel out when you really feel powerless, because not only are you not affecting what's happening outside, you can't even affect what's happening inside. And also, we need to lay into place internalized structures that are able to process the information that's coming in from the outside world at a higher level. Because at the most basic level are things like survival. But if it's just kind of man eat dog, and that's the level of our interaction, well, we know where that leads to. The world is not going to really evolve very high. It's only when we've kind of taken care of those basic kind of survival needs that we then can elevate and begin thinking about things like cooperation, right? Altruism, compassion. One of my Taoist teachers said that, human beings were naturally curious. You look at a little kid, they spend their entire life exploring the world. Well, we don't want to lose that inner knack for creativity. We want to stoke that. And so he said that by becoming curious, you learn about other people. And when you learn about other people and their lives and their situations, what do you find out? They're pretty much just like us. They're pretty much like you. Then you can relate to them with compassion, and relating to ourselves and other people from that more non-judgmental stance, from a position of being empathic and compassionate. That's where we really want to go. So this is part of the spiritual basis of the martial art training, is becoming so self-aware and so self-confident that we can relate to others with humanity and compassion. And in spite of the fact of having all these tools at my hand's disposal, where I can chop and punch and elbow and do all of these things to harm human beings, wouldn't it be better if I took my knowledge and skills and tools and helped people feel better about themselves? It's better to create rather than to destroy. And that's the ethics that we want to imprint in our way of just seeing the world and seeing other people. Because there's far too much violence out there in the world, obviously. And violence comes from where? It's inside of us. When we feel separate and split inside, then those parts of ourselves that we don't like or can't accept get split off. And it becomes the other. And then when that's externalized, that's all you see when you look around the world. People saying, oh, the other. My side versus that side. My country versus that country. My people versus those people. And as long as we're thinking like that, we're not going to go anywhere, folks. We're not going to go anywhere. We're going to continue doing the same violent trip we've been doing for several thousand years. And yet, look at what we're capable of. Look at the incredible acts of love and compassion that the human soul and spirit is capable of. But if we don't have a tool to access that by healing the splits, first within ourselves and then in our relationships, our personal relationships, our community relationships, our national and international relationships, and number one, our relationship with our mother, planet Earth herself, which of course is at risk right now. If we don't heal all of that, we could very easily become extinct. Again, it's happened 5 or 6 times in the past.
Yeah.
And so now it's in our hands. It's in our hands. And that's what this means. When we put our hands together like this as martial artists, it means the internal and the external coming together as one, right? The mind and the body, the right brain and the left brain, the brain and the heart, the other and the self, becoming a whole unity. And that's why at the beginning of every martial art class, we do this. And that was from the Shaolin Temple. And it meant that this external and this internal come together in a harmonious way so that the totality of all life is embraced. And that's what we're really here to teach people how to do, how to embrace themselves and embrace others so we can make this world a paradise, a garden, and not let it just degrade and we become extinct again.
Again. So some of the nicest people I've met have been martial artists who've stepped in and tapped into their anger and kind of resolved some of these internal issues and realized that the self and the other are the same. And we have this really kind of dangerous movement I see out there in this kind of like music festival spiritualist community where it's like, well, I'm more spiritual than you, and F those guys, and we're more enlightened than the others, and so there's all of this kind of nouveau kind of fad spirituality that's not anchored in any of these kind of self-correcting principles that makes one look at themselves more. And I think that there's also a piece of that's kind of deeply embedded in the martial arts. I mean, Lord knows when I was in my 20s, used to kick the shit out of me every time I got cocky, and I expect someone to constantly be there in my life to do that. And that's also part of it, right? Is to have fellowship with other martial artists and people to allow for that circle to hold and contain you and help you remember to keep growing. And so I think we need to be there for each other in that capacity as well. Look, I was going to say I could talk to you for hours because I've been talking to you for 30 years. I would love to have people be more exposed to your work and your teachings. Like I said, this is my primary martial arts teacher, Qigong teacher for decades now, and I love this man. So, Dr. Totton, Grandmaster Totton, where can people find you in our online universe?
Well, I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I'm a professor of psychology at the university. And so I teach psychology and well-being. My specialty, in fact, is self-care, self-healing. And so my website actually is my name, drcarltotton.com. That's my psychologist workshop website. And then for all of these martial arts, healing arts, Qigong, meditation, I'm the director of a place called the Taoist Institute. It's pronounced with a D, but spelled with a T. Taoist Institute, if you will. And so www.taoistinstitute.com is that web address. And you will see I have DVDs available and all my class schedules. I just participated in writing a book about stress release, in fact. And I have a series of podcasts called What's This Tao All About? And that's actually available on iTunes. You can actually look up What's This Tao All About and see a series of a dozen podcasts I've done all about Taoism and philosophy and how to apply this to our daily lives.
Beautiful, beautiful. I really, really respect the fact that you're also tech savvy and going for it on the new media because it's all about change. And so you're super adaptive, and I love it. Love you. Thank you. Keep up the good work. And if you're listening to this or watching this and you're anywhere in the LA area, get down to North Hollywood and see this gentleman. It is a rarity to have someone like this in your area. So again, thanks very much, and check him out. Hey, so I hope you enjoyed that. You can tell why I love this man. He is really doing important work, and I am trying to bear the torch, carry the torch of the wisdom that has been imparted over the last 20 years of my life through him and the grandmasters and all the people through our lineage. If you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments. Please share this with people who need to hear this. My job is to help bring this wisdom and preserve it in our world. You'll see me doing all kinds of interviews, but this is the stuff. This is the stuff that I really kind of come from. And so I'm really happy to have been able to share it with you. I will see you next week. Enjoy and find out how you can be an urban monk in your life this week.